Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Southeast New England Program Network, welcome to our webinar titled Hydrologic Response Units, a Recipe for More Uniform Stormwater Planning, brought to you by the Cape Cod Commission. My name is Leah Soloway from the New England Environmental Finance Center, and I'll be assisting with logistics for today's program along with Tess Clark from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the SNEP Network. The SNEP Network's mission is to empower communities to achieve healthy watersheds, sustainable financing, and long-term climate resilience through management of stormwater and restoration projects. We focus on building local capacity by providing no-cost trainings, webinars, and technical assistance to communities in the SNEP region. If you want to learn more, please visit snepnetwork.org for more information. Before we begin the webinar, there are a few logistics to keep in mind. First, everyone will be on mute to ensure audio quality. You'll be able to ask questions by typing them into the questions box on your GoToWebinar control panel. We look forward to answering questions, so please type them in at any time. Additionally, you can request a certificate of attendance for joining this webinar. Information on how to do so will be available in our follow-up email after the webinar. We also have closed captions available for today's webinar. To view the closed captions, please click the link that I will put in the chat. On that note, I'd like to hand things over to our guest presenter, Tim Praxakarnis, who will kick things off with today's presentation. Thanks, Tim.
All right, thank you, Leah. Hopefully I'm unmuted, sharing screen correctly and all that good stuff. Thanks again. I'm Tim Praxakarnis. I'm a water resources analyst with the Cape Cod Commission. I'm joined by Emma Curran, GIS analyst at the Commission, and Ann Reynolds, our GIS director. The two of them are the real brains behind everything that we're going to present today, which is, as Leah brought up in the introduction, is a approach to try and provide a little bit more consistency to the way that stormwater planning happens, for Cape Cod, as far as the Cape Cod Commission is concerned, but then also looking to expand it out throughout the southern New England and SNEP regions. All right, so let's start. This is probably not a surprise to anyone. We're going to talk about stormwater and a couple of the primary reasons why we're interested in stormwater, interested or concerned, right, is because of its potential to create flooding problems, the potential to transport nutrients and transport sediment. If there are any astute listeners out there, there's probably another concern that you can identify, which is bacteria, but that's one that the approach that we're going to discuss today does not help us in estimating, so that's why it's omitted right now. And before we go further, we have a super quick poll that we would like to bring up just to get an idea of what everyone's level of familiarity with stormwater and stormwater planning is, because if people are pretty familiar with it, we can skip through some of the introductory stuff that is in this story map, which is there, to make it accessible to everyone, but we don't want to spend too much time rehashing things that attendees already know.
Fantastic. It looks like about 75% of folks have filled out our poll, which is just as Tim said, asking, are you familiar with stormwater? It's 5 if you're very familiar and a 1 if you're not at all familiar. And in about 3 more seconds, I'm going to go ahead and close it. So last chance to participate. We're closing the poll in 3, 2, and 1. And as for the results, Tim, it looks like you're correct. We have a very experienced audience with us today, as you can see.
Awesome. Well, that's kind of what we assumed, because the topic is a little kind of detailed and dense in the world of stormwater, and perhaps might not be super attractive to the casual, someone who's casually interested. All right, so I'm going to move very quickly through this introductory section, right? So everyone knows what stormwater is, how it's basically runoff that's created from precipitation, and the trends for increased stormwater runoff, why that's happening, increases in development impervious surfaces, decreases in natural and forested areas, leads to greater runoff, and the impacts of it. So all of those 4 things highlighted at the beginning are really the primary reasons why we're concerned about it and why all of the planning and management of it that's going on throughout the region and the country, why all of that is happening. And one of the things that certainly throughout the SNEP network that we're trying to work on or figure out is the regulatory environment for stormwater is a little strange, right? So there are layers upon layers of stormwater regulation from kind of the federal level all the way down to the local level. And a lot of the time, if you think about how stormwater management itself actually occurs, it's often at kind of local like site plan review. So lots of individual designs and installations happening in ways that are, not necessarily connected to one another. And one of the things that we do at the commission pretty frequently is we look for opportunities to use data that is kind of publicly and widely accessible to create tools that that have wide applicability to help avoid the situation where you have a lot of towns or municipalities doing the same kinds of activities, and they're all doing it in isolation, and they may be sort of spending their own time, they may be hiring consultants, and there's a lot of kind of missed opportunity if everyone's doing the same thing but in isolation, doing it 10, 15, 20 times, when if there was a kind of transparent way that everyone could do it, a lot of that time and effort could be saved and put towards towards other planning activities or other priorities. And we've the commission has developed tools of this nature for for wastewater planning, for coastal resilience, but stormwater has been a little bit trickier for us to figure out until we kind of stumbled upon some work that EPA did on Martha's Vineyard, using this concept of hydrologic response units, which are, Emma's going to detail a little bit later, but basically they're sort of a planning unit that you can use to make assessing your own stormwater situation and prioritizing how you might address it, just to make it a little bit easier and more standardized. And so these HRUs are the focus of what we're going to talk about now. But it's important to mention that not only do they sort of have applicability as we're going to present them as just kind of the outputs from this HRU exercise, but they can also serve as inputs to more sophisticated stormwater models. All right, and then just to reiterate kind of how, why we're in the situation we're in. So there are these layers of stormwater regulation and management, right? So EPA, and in Massachusetts, kind of EPA in conjunction with Mass DEP administers MS4 permits, and so you have towns managing stormwater for sort of their publicly owned properties, lands, and infrastructure. And then on Cape Cod, there's also the area-wide water quality management plan, referred to as the 208 plan. And so this plan was largely focused on coastal water quality. And again, a big portion of that is wastewater related, but stormwater is a component of the the nutrients that are impairing coastal waters. And really the 208 plan focused a lot on looking outside of town-centric planning, but looking at watersheds. And that's something that we've kind of constantly had in our heads throughout all of the work we do, is to start to look at planning units that make sense, that aren't just sort of arbitrarily defined by political boundaries or things like that. And so that was part of the driver for this project, which was to figure out, what would be a resource that towns can use to do stormwater planning, really at whatever scale makes sense and is important to them. So it could be a particular neighborhood, or it could be an entire watershed that's shared among a couple of towns. And really making sure that everybody's using the same inputs and kind of the same recipe is a way to decrease how complicated it is to do larger planning efforts, or planning efforts that span boundaries. So that's sort of another layer to kind of the context for stormwater planning, at least as we see it on Cape Cod, and just nutrient management in general. All right, and so I will hand it off to Emma, and she's going to go into a lot more detail about how we actually go from this idea of creating a stormwater planning tool to something that towns can actually use.
Yep, thanks, Tim. So in order to begin looking at the impact of stormwater, you have to determine how you can estimate runoff and pollutant loads. And the three things that go into that are land cover, land use, and soil type. And within that, land cover is pervious and impervious designations for each. There we go. So what are HRUs? Hydrologic response units are areas of land that have similar features, and they're expected to react to precipitation and other weather events in similar ways. And using raw data for land use, land cover, and soil type, there was approximately 14,000 different possible combinations of those things that would lead into determining pollutant estimates and runoff, which is a really unmanageable amount, whether you're looking at it at a local or a larger scale level. So in order to scale down the amount of options, the EPA developed a crosswalk to condense this raw data into more manageable categories. So down to 7 for land type, 4 for soil, and the 2 for pervious and impervious, which created 56 potential results, which is much more manageable when you're looking at it for several different levels. So for each of these calculated HRU classes, the 56, EPA's stormwater management model can be used to estimate the runoff potential and pollutant load that are for total nitrogen, total phosphorus, total suspended solids, and zinc. And these rates give estimates of the pounds of pollutant that are annually transported by runoff for a particular HRU class. And that's essential for pinpointing different areas that have the ability to generate large amounts of runoff, which is something important when it comes to stormwater planning. So understanding this in general, as well as being able to identify different hotspots, is really important for management. And HRUs have been used before, such as in the EPA's OPTI tool, to determine runoff and pollutant loads. So it has been used before, and the OPTI tool is a more advanced planning model for stormwater. So getting into the different data inputs that we did for this analysis, the land cover and land use data came from 2016 MassGIS data, and as you can see from that chart on the left-hand side, there were 18 different categorizations in the original data. And in combination with land use, which had 16 different possibilities. These two things were used within EPA's crosswalk to create condensed 7 land use categories, much more simplified and manageable. So the land cover and land use had specific qualifications that were made into the final results for land use categories, which we'll see a little bit below. The next piece of data is soil, which was gathered by the United States Department of Agriculture and had 8 original categorizations, and those were simplified down into 4. And in this chart below, you can see there's a few combined hydrologic soil groupings there, and for those, the more conservative HSG value was taken, and the higher one was gotten rid of when it came to recategorizing them. The next step was establishing a grid in order to put the HRUs and their results into. So based on the input data layer resolution and different performance factors, 10 by 10 meter grid cells were determined to be the proper one for this particular HRU classification. And for comparison, that's about the size of a 2-car garage. In smaller study areas, it might make more sense, excuse me, to adjust the size of those meter grid cells, but for our particular research and analysis, 10 by 10 meter grid cells was well suited for this. So from there, we get into our modified, as in the 56 categories, HRU output. So the reclassified land cover and land use, the soil type, as well as our 10 by 10 meter grid cell, all combined to form this final result. So within each of those grid cells in the final result, there's all different types of information, including runoff potential and pollutant estimates. The impervious designation was a big conversation with this and how to determine whether the 10 by 10 meter grid cell should be assigned as pervious or impervious. And based on our case studies and looking with the grid cell and land cover and land use layers, as well as looking at aerials, we determined that we were going to use a 30% threshold. And if more than 30% of the land within a 10 by 10 meter cell was impervious, the entire cell would be given the impervious designation. And on the flip side, more than 70% was pervious, the entire cell would be classified as pervious. And slope, although slope can be considered during stormwater planning, for our purposes, we did not include it in this analysis. It actually plays quite a small role in determining runoff and pollutant loads. It could be looked at in more site-specific circumstances to include it in a different HRU analysis, but for our circumstances, we did not include it. As Tim mentioned a little bit earlier, impervious surfaces have really a tremendous impact on soil runoff and thus pollutant loads. Pervious surfaces have the ability to infiltrate rainwater and runoff into the soils, and impervious surfaces do not. So in comparison with pervious surfaces, impervious ones have about 15 times more runoff, leading to about 20 times more phosphorus, nitrogen, and total suspended solids within that runoff. Now Tim is going to give everybody a little bit of a rundown on some of the pollutant load estimates for particular land uses that were generated from the HRUs.
All right, thanks, Emma. So yeah, the next step in this process, now that we've sort of turned everything into one of those 56 HRU classes, which makes for neat color-coded maps without having a ridiculous number of colors to make sense of, is to go from those HRU classes to the things that we're interested in, right? Which are runoff and the various nutrients or suspended solids. And so how you do that is we used EPA's stormwater management model, or it's kind of abbreviated as SWIM, which has built-in precipitation data, I think a 30-year record of precipitation from the weather station at Boston Logan Airport. But the SWIM module, which I think is packaged with their Opti tool, has the ability, has instructions and the ability to take more localized precipitation data and do, generate your own versions of these runoff and pollutant load estimates. So if you have a weather station, a hyperlocal weather station that you want to use, you can calculate your own runoff and pollutant load factors. But for our purposes, which was kind of Barnstable County as a whole, but also thinking of applicability for kind of Southeast New England and EPA Region 1, we just went with the built-in precipitation data series from Logan Airport. And again, just to kind of show where where those multipliers that we just showed came from, you can see for these kind of maroonish bars, depending on the land type, whether it's agricultural land versus developed land versus forest, the amount of runoff generated, can vary some, particularly for the dashed bars, which is pervious agricultural, developed, and forested land. And I think, one of the interesting things to look at here is that even pervious land within a developed setting tends to generate a bit more runoff than, say, natural settings, forests, agricultural fields. And that's just because, within a developed landscape, even, say, a type A soil tends to be more compacted than in a natural landscape. But really, the take home, right, is that pervious cover in any of those situations generates a lot less runoff than impervious. And if we start to look at some of the other, loadings that the stormwater management model predicts, again, we see the same thing, which is depending on the surrounding kind of land use, the phosphorus loads can vary a little bit for pervious cover, but again, they're significantly higher, on the order of 20 times higher off of impervious surfaces than they are pervious surfaces. So phosphorus definitely of interest on Cape Cod in the area of freshwater ponds. So that's, all of these different those different concerns that we highlighted at the beginning may be of interest to folks who are doing stormwater planning for different reasons around different water resources. And I think that's one of the big advantages of what we've done here, is just made it a really versatile tool that can be used in a number of different ways. So similarly, nitrogen, big concern for all of the coastal waters on Cape Cod. Again, some variability depending on land use for how much nitrogen is generated from pervious surfaces, but much higher nitrogen loads off of impervious surfaces, probably no big surprise. And then total suspended solids, again, just the kind of masses of suspended solids that are generated. And I should mention that these are all per acre. So the units of runoff in inches per year, and then phosphorus, nitrogen, and TSS in pounds per year, those are per acre of either pervious or impervious surface. And again, it's almost a 20-fold increase in suspended solids that are generated off of impervious surfaces compared to pervious. So we're talking about like going from a bucket of sediment essentially to a wheelbarrow full, looking at 1 acre of pervious versus impervious. So combining all of these loading rates with the actual areas in or sort of acreages of the different HRUs within a study area is how you can go to an actual mass of whatever you're interested in or a volume of runoff that's being generated. Okay, so again, we kind of spoke to the importance of having kind of a uniform way to do this. And that's important for regional consistency, to know that, you know, if a town is using this to do stormwater planning, that their neighbor is doing it the same way. But it's also important because we know that the data that we used is, you know, at this point, 2016 land use land cover, it's 6 years old. It's, if not outdated now, it will be, and there will be new data available, and we want to be able to take advantage of that when that new and theoretically more accurate data is available. So I will turn it over to Emma to speak a little bit more about kind of the details of how that's accomplished here, and then we'll move on to, you know, some real world applications of the tool.
Yeah, so like Tim said, it's really important to be able to keep up with new and updated data that comes along, and this HRU methodology was created as a script and meant to automate the process, which in turn saves time and resources that can be put towards looking at the results of the HRU output and hopefully into planning and management practices. So this script, like I said, created with land use inputs, soil inputs, whenever those are updated or new data becomes available, one would be able to plug them into this script, potentially change the 10 by 10 meter grid cell size if they were looking at a smaller or more specific area, and then run that process, which would generate an HRU output for the desired area. This is really important for the means of updated data, as well as saving time and being able to have more accurate information as it comes out, and it wouldn't take a long time in order to update that. So there wouldn't be lost time on going through this process. So this HRU analysis was used within a case study in Truro, Massachusetts, at the Village Pond watershed. And for this case study, there was concern about the health of the pond within the area due to runoff and pollutants, and which was leading to excessive algae growth. Overall, very detrimental to the health of the pond and the adjacent watershed and things like that. So the following maps are all for the study area, going to display the different land use, soil type, runoff potential, and phosphorus and nitrogen loads that could come from the specific area based on that land use. So this is the modified HRU result. As you can see from the legend, those are the categories of land use that came from the EPA crosswalk, as well as an impervious or pervious designation alongside of it. And most of this study area, it was classified as developed pervious, which within the crosswalk was determined to be a combination of several different pervious land types, like commercial and industrial, some of the residentials, and open land. So that's why most of that is categorized as developed pervious.
And Emma, that developed pervious covers like residential lawns, right? And sort of landscaped areas within commercial and industrial. So the sort of vegetated but disturbed soil that we see on,
Yes.
on a lot of our kind of suburban landscapes.
Yes, that's correct. So that's, although it is listed as developed, which one may think might be impervious, it was actually determined that there's pervious within that. Like, for example, like a lawn. Technically a developed area, but a lawn is pervious. So here is land type. So land type within this particular study area, you can see is mostly medium density residential as well as commercial for businesses and pavement, streets, things like that. And those impervious surfaces have a much larger impact on runoff, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So it was important to determine where the areas are that are going to have the greater impact. Here is the soil map for this particular study area. The area within the pond and the watershed have a higher runoff potential than the rest of the study area, which was HSGA. The pond here has a much larger runoff potential because of restrictions with water transmission in that area due to the soil. And here's a map of the runoff within this particular region. So as you can see, the higher impervious areas such as roads, homes, and things like that have a higher runoff potential at 40.8 inches per year. It's very clear which areas are contributing to this larger runoff potential. All the impervious surfaces where there's pavement and development and things like that are much higher, even in comparison to the next highest one, which the highest is only at 11 inches per year. So for phosphorus, the highest part is actually determined to be some of the residential areas rather than the street areas, which is very interesting to look at. Commercial industrial areas as well as streets and pavement, they do have the next highest phosphorus loading number, but it is not as high as the other impervious surfaces such as the medium and high density residential areas. And nitrogen follows similarly to runoff, where all of the impervious areas have the highest nitrogen loading rate, and the other ones are much lower than that of the highest. So the roads, pavement, developed areas are all in the highest section, while the others are much lower. So this was a case study done for the town of Mashpee of Santuit Pond watershed, and I'm going to hand back to Tim to talk a little bit more about this.
All right, thanks, Emma. Yeah, so some of the outputs that came out of that the previous case study, may not be super surprising, right? That the areas that are sort of commercial, industrial, more densely developed, more impervious are going to contribute greater amounts of runoff and greater amounts of pollutants. But one of the neat things is that because this was built around that 10 by 10 or 10 meter by 10 meter grid layout that Emma described, is that you can select, you can select an area, say a particular parcel or a set of parcels or a watershed, and get, an actual mass or an actual volume of runoff and a mass of phosphorus or nitrogen, and then, be able to kind of concretely discuss what are the potential benefits of implementing some new stormwater management in this area, or you can use it to compare one smaller study area against another. So I think we're still very much in the early stages of exploring that potential, but I thought that was something important to point out as we are moving forward. As Emma mentioned, our other case study is sort of tied to a technical assistance project that the SNEP network is in the middle of right now with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and the town of Mashpee, looking at Santuit Pond, which is a 170-acre great pond, of great historical significance to the Wampanoag tribe. And that pond has experienced some pretty significant deterioration of its water quality, which is, it's impacting its recreational uses. It's also impacting, so the Santuit Pond is the headwater to the Santuit River, which drains into Popponesset Bay, which includes some tribal, historical tribal areas for shell fishing. So the pond itself and the downstream resources are all of cultural significance to the tribe, but they're in a position where they don't have control over most of the land that surrounds the pond, certainly, and upstream land in the watershed too. And so the technical assistance project involves both the town and the tribe to develop a watershed-based plan that looks at both in-pond and watershed-based approaches to try and address some of those water quality problems and hopefully restore some of those uses that were so historically significant. And what this technical assistance project gave us an opportunity to do was to really test out that idea of how important is it to be able to incorporate new data when it becomes available. And the reason that it was kind of tailor-made for that is the watershed-based plan tool does kind of a similar analysis to what we did, but when it was developed, it was using the 2005 MassGIS land use and land cover data set. And so here's a quick snapshot of the watershed to Santuit Pond, what it looked like according to the 2005 MassGIS data layer, and what it looks like according to the 2016 data layer. And so you can see that there's pretty significant differences. There's a lot more of the orange medium density residential in 2016 than there was in 2005. There's less of the high density. There's a little bit less forest cover. And so we can actually look at very explicitly what those changes were from the 2005 data set to the 2016 data set. And so what do we see over the course of 11 years within this pond watershed? So we see decreases in high density residential and increases in medium density residential and commercial industrial. So some of that's likely reclassification, I would guess, but obviously that 25 acres of high density residential doesn't explain the 250 acres of medium density and commercial increases. So I think there are some real land use changes reflected as well. Again, the increases in open land and agriculture, those might be, they could be actual increases in kind of cultivated land, but likely reclassifications from forests. But really dramatically, reduction in forested land of nearly 300 acres. And so that's, when you're talking about a fairly small watershed, that's a pretty dramatic difference. And, I think we all know that intuitively, but then we can go from that kind of land use analysis and say, all right, this is a freshwater pond. We're really concerned about phosphorus loading. Santuit Pond has a significant internal phosphorus load. So that's phosphorus, that was generated historically that's now bound up in the pond sediments that can be re-released. So that's that's an issue that needs to be dealt with outside of kind of the scope of our analysis. But at the same time, if we have a watershed that's continuing to contribute phosphorus to the pond, that's gonna be a recurring problem because it's gonna regenerate that internal phosphorus load. So if we're gonna design watershed solutions to try and address that, we'd like to have a sense of that the loads we're planning for from the watershed are kind of as accurate as they can be and as reflective of reality as they can be. And so this is what the phosphorus loads look like based on the 2005 land use land cover. So those are the dashed bars, and the 2016 land use land cover, which are the solid bars. And things can get a little bit funky if we look just within an individual category, right? So we're showing that there's more phosphorus coming from agricultural lands than there was previously. Do we think that's because more phosphorus is sort of being loaded onto agricultural lands, or is it strictly because maybe some forested lands are now classified as agriculture? I would vote for the latter. And again, it looks like there's less phosphorus coming from forest, but that's because there's less forest cover. So really, what's important to take from this, though, is if we kind of aggregate all those sort of conversions of land use and changes within the individual categories, we see that if you're estimating how much phosphorus is coming from the watershed based on old data, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 375 pounds per year. And using the new data, it's closer to 500. And so you might think differently about what your approach, what the scale of your approach is and where you want to start to try and implement solutions, depending on whether you're using 375 as your estimated watershed load versus the almost 500. So again, just to highlight that new data sources are going to become available, and if you have kind of a workflow that you can just plug new data into and kind of readily rerun these estimates, you can stay up to date on your planning and make sure that that the planning you're doing, kind of, which we all know are not quick processes generally, that you're not doing it based on outdated information. Okay, so where do we go from here? This is basically kind of the big output from all of the work that Emma and Ann put into this, which was, we've HRU'd all of Barnstable County. So the whole county broken down into 10 meter by 10 meter squares, and then given one of those 56 HRU classifications. And so from that, then every single one of those grid cells has a runoff estimate, nitrogen, phosphorus, total suspended solids. And we can, do the sorts of analysis that we did in Santuit Pond and that we looked at in Truro for, whatever study area is of interest. Again, it could be, a single parcel, it could be a zoning district, it could be a neighborhood or a pond watershed, all of those sorts of things. But where we're at right now is, we have this data set, and we have kind of a static map here, but we'd really like to just make it interactive so that rather than having to kind of get the data from GIS staff at the commission, that folks are able to just explore it and work with it on their own. And so the idea to do that was to have this be in an interactive viewer, much like the earlier maps. So the Truro case study, all those maps that we breezed through, if you check out the story map afterwards, those are all interactive. You can scroll and zoom and pan around and click on things to get information about them. And so that's the idea that we'd like to do for this data set at the county level. but we've run into a couple of snags. So within Barnstable County, there are 10.5 million cells. And while that works okay in, an ArcGIS desktop kind of setting, it's proven to be really challenging to have kind of a functional interactive viewer with just so many different units that have to be displayed. So that's something that we are working on. And then again, as we have more opportunities to use this with some case studies and apply it to real world situations, we're going to continue kind of looking at things like that 30% impervious threshold and other little tweaks that we can do to figure out how to make this tool as useful as possible, kind of balancing accuracy and performance all along the way. So I think that's kind of, I don't know, Emma, if you have anything else to add for what we're trying to do with this moving forward. And then certainly there are some added resources and acknowledgements in the story map for people who want to dig into those things a little deeper. But I think at this point we can start taking questions.
Great, thank you so much, Tim and Emma. I want to remind folks that our colleague Ann Reynolds has just posted a link to the story map in the chat. We wanted to make sure everybody had it, but we waited a little while just because it is a web app that could be overloaded. So that's available now. I know a few of you asked that question. And I'm seeing only mostly questions related to how to get the story map, which I think is great. So please remember to post other questions in the questions box so we can get to those. I'd like to start with a question, just maybe for both Tim and Emma, but maybe you could share what the most surprising thing that you found through this whole process. Like maybe each of you kind of hinted at a few things, but what was the most surprising finding so far?
Tim, you want to go first?
To start.
Well, yeah, so I think one of the things that has been, I don't know if it's necessarily surprising so much as it's just been really interesting to try and wrap my head around is right. So we all know impervious surfaces are a huge problem, right? And they contribute these massive amounts of runoff, of nutrients. Like that's no surprise to anyone. But I guess one of the interesting things is the concept of this developed pervious. So like even if we're looking at it and we think, oh, like that's this new development has some nice landscaped areas. And it looks, at first glance, like it would be just as effective at managing stormwater as, say, kind of untouched forest or some sort of native area, and that's not the case. And what we actually saw, like for the Santuit Pond example, for instance, so we also looked, in addition to the land use land cover change, we also looked at impervious cover estimates based on the 2005 land use data or land cover data, the 2016 land cover data, and also a third source, which is an aerial flyover of Barnstable County that the commission had done, and some planimetric data from that. And we found all of those estimates of impervious coverage to be really similar. So that 2005 to 2016 changes in phosphorus loading wasn't because there was a huge jump in impervious surface, but it was because there were changes in land use. So, you know, even though impervious surfaces are really the dramatic, you know, cause for dramatic changes, it's never just one or the other. It's really that interplay of certainly more impervious surface, but even changing, you know, just the reductions in kind of open space forested areas. They really work in tandem, and being able to put numbers to that was kind of eye-opening.
Yeah, it's I mean, we can never get enough data on some of these things. So the questions have started to roll in. So I think we can revisit your most surprising thing, Emma, at the end if we have time. But just to get quickly into it, why use hydrologic groups as the soil input over the drainage class? Maybe that's one for Emma or even Anne, who's on as well, or Tim.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think it goes back to how Tim said that there was a study done on Martha's Vineyard that we read a lot about from the report, and that was the HSGs that they used. We decided to use something similar. I'm not too familiar with background on, sorry, the other thing that was mentioned. I don't have too much on that.
Yeah, I think another another element of this is that while we certainly went into this kind of with the idea of working at the Cape Cod County level, it being a project that we did as a SNEP network partner, we wanted to think about how to craft it with much wider applicability. And so, you know, we wanted to use a kind of certainly regional level, if not national level, data set, which is where the soil classes came from USDA. Again, this is a debate that we have, you know, fairly frequently, which is if you have better, higher resolution local data that you want to use, you know, how can that be accommodated? And certainly if you have, you know, if you have a like a drainage class that you can use, I think the tricky part is going from sort of your HRU to an estimate for runoff or for phosphorus or nitrogen, and that, you know, developing what those numbers are is certainly kind of beyond my and our capabilities. So that's why we use the, you know, the same input layers that were used for in this, you know, the EPA kind of recipe that goes into the stormwater management model and goes into OptiTool. But certainly if you're wanting to do something locally and you think that drainage class is better, you know, is more reflective than the HSG group, and you can figure out a way to do that, then by all means, that's, you know, that's the way to go whenever you have kind of more accurate or better data. But that was, you know, that was how we ended up where we did, which was trying to use larger, widely available data sets and use them with those already established runoff and pollutant or nutrient loading factors.
And Tim, I'm just going to add that for comparative purposes, you know, we wanted to use similar data than what was used in the past in order to do a proof of concept here.
I think that segues nicely into this next question, which is about how you might be accounting for the differences in methodology for the land use between the 2005 and 2016 models. And then there's this part two to that question is, how will that impact the use of future data sets that are in development?
So I think what Michaela is getting at is why there are differences between 05 and 16 versus how did we adapt to that. So I'm going to go with why. And, you know, the resolution of the land cover data from 2005 was a smaller scale or than 2016 was. And so there are just boundary issues that come up. But also as Tim pointed out, there's definition changes that occur over time, you know, where high density residential had a particular definition in 2005 that was then modified in 2016, likely based on that resolution difference. You know, that sort of thing is going to happen as we move forward, but the higher quality data that we get, that we have to date, you know, using like 4-inch imagery in the 2016 land cover data set, certainly there's less room for improvement there. So moving forward, I think there's going to be, you know, we'll continue to have a more standardized definition of these land uses and land covers.
Yeah, and I
Great.
think to just speak really quickly to the how do we adapt to those changes in methodology. So that's all kind of buried within the crosswalks that go from the, you know, the 18 or the 16 different options within each individual layer down to the kind of 4 or 5. And so what the crosswalk for 2005 looks different from the crosswalk for 2016. And I think that reclassification to some degree has that adaptation built into it, because the HRUs are going to be the same. We're always going to have, you know, what we're showing here: agriculture, impervious, pervious, commercial, industrial, impervious, those sorts of things. What goes into them from the, you know, the raw land use, land cover data set might change from, you know, among data sets, but I think the hope is that the crosswalks are covering that by getting those individual land uses and land covers kind of into the right bucket as far as HRUs are concerned.
Great. Okay, and so the next question has to do with the cell size. So were there considerations about increasing the size of the cells to address the challenge of having too many?
No, there weren't any considerations about increasing it. You know, if you really want to get a good estimate of runoff potential and pollutant estimates, I think a 10 by 10 meter grid cell is a pretty decent size. Like we said earlier about the size of a 2-car garage, and if you can picture that and all the different types of land cover and impervious or pervious, you know, covers that there are within that type of area, depending on where you're at, that's could be a pretty large area. So there are definitely a lot of discussions about the size of the grid cells. But to be honest, it was mostly about whether we could go smaller. And the 10 by 10 meter grid cell came off of the resolution that we had for the different layers that we used.
Yeah, so I think that gets into, you know, another aspect of the accuracy versus performance debate is once you start to go larger. So even at the 10 meter size, we ran into a little bit of, you know, needing to make a decision with the impervious cover, which is at a 1 meter resolution. And so how do you determine, when you have a 10 by 10 cell, where do you draw the line for calling that whole thing pervious or impervious? And if we start to go larger than that, then we're going to have to make those same decisions about about soil, about land cover, about land use. and that, that I think gets to, starts to bring in some concerns about the accuracy of it, because you're just going to end up, at like a county level, maybe everything will average out, but if you make the grid cells bigger and then you move down to a smaller study area, you may have some of that rounding error actually impacting the calculations that you do. So we think there are solutions to be able to use the 10 by 10 grid cells and make it interactive. We've done similar things with previous applications that the commission has developed. We think there's maybe a smoother way to do it this time, and so that's what we're working on, but we have kind of some of those historical approaches that we can fall back on if need be.
Okay, so it is noon and we did budget a little extra time. So for folks that have any or need to get to lunch or need to get to another meeting, feel free, but we are going to take the next few questions here since there's a couple, and we'll definitely conclude in the next 10 minutes or so, but feel free to stay on with us if you'd like, or leave if you have other engagements. So the next question is, how are individual towns now making use of this great database?
We have kept this a little bit to ourselves for now and trying to perfect the process and the scripts. And we've only used it for small case studies in certain towns. I don't think we've released the data to each town individually yet, but it will obviously be of great use to them when that time comes.
Yeah, this is the big launch for it. So
yep.
aside from it existing in story map form, and again, we've been hoping to have it be available a little bit more interactively, but certainly at the moment, the data is available and can be provided, to anyone who's interested. But I think just knowing the kind of time constraints on town staff and varying capabilities in the GIS departments, having something that is really easy to jump into would be, will definitely be more valuable to them. But certainly any town GIS folks that want to dig into this, we've got lots of grid cells that we can pass along for your enjoyment.
Awesome. Sounds like there's a lot, if you are from one of the towns, that you have something to look forward to. So you'll have to keep us all posted on how it goes when you start using this tool. Next question is, do you have to run a script to do this process? If so, is there good documentation of it somewhere?
Yes, there's extensive documentation of it. There was a lot of testing that had to be done in order to get it to run just right and in a quick amount of time. So yes, there is a script for it. If you ran it by hand, it would take a great amount of time just to personally get in there and calculate these certain things, especially when you're assigning runoff potential and pollutant loads. Each of those 56 cells, most of them have all different numbers with each other. So you'd be having to select, this certain land type, this certain soil type, pervious, impervious, to assign it something specific. So the script is a great time saver, and there is documentation of the process for creating it and how to use it when it's parameterized for inputting one's specific data that they would want to use to update it or to look at something different in particular.
Awesome.
And
okay.
just to clarify, that's for outside of Barnstable County. If you're talking within Barnstable County, the script has already been run.
Correct, yes.
Okay, just a couple more questions. So in this next question, it says, it looks like roadways show up as industrial or commercial. Is it common for roadways to show up this way? typically?
In my experience with looking at the land use and the different studies that were done previous to this one, yes, they've been classified as that, and that's all within the EPA crosswalk. If you look at the 16 different land use types, those got all funneled into this commercial industrial grouping via that crosswalk.
Yeah, and I think roadways can get funny too, right? So I think some of that has to do with there being like a land use classification as right of way that gets funneled into one of those, because there are such a thing like forest impervious, right? That's kind of a not very intuitive classification that probably refers to things like paved paths and roads within a largely forested area. But depending on how the land use is classified, those might be categorized as a right of way, and then get kind of through the crosswalk may end up getting dumped into that commercial industrial impervious category.
Great. Thanks for clarifying there. And then the last question is, where can the land use / land cover crosswalks be found?
I believe the EPA has those available via their website to download. Right, Tim?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know I got them directly from EPA, and I can't recall if they are published currently or not. So I will have to check in on that and see. I know they've been used in several EPA projects, and they may be within the documentation for that, but I can definitely follow up and figure out if there's an easy way to point people to the crosswalks.
And if there is, Tim, we can share that link on the resources section of the story map to make that available to everyone.
Great. Yep, and Tim's information is also posted on the screen currently. It's right at the bottom of the story map screen, so folks can get in touch directly with our speakers today. Just as a reminder, you will get a link to the recording for this webinar, and it will also be posted on the SNEP Network website, so you're welcome to revisit any of the information. And on that note, Tim, Emma, and Anne, do you have any closing comments?
No, nothing major other than keep posted, like Ann said, since what we presented is a story map. We'll kind of continue to update it as we have either new developments or new case studies to include. So it's going to be kind of a living document that we hope will continue to improve over time, and certainly that we are available to try and help get this approach to be usable elsewhere outside the county. So as people are looking to try and replicate it in their own region of interest, like Emma said, the script itself is available, and either the SNEP network or commission staff themselves, can answer questions about what we've done and what went into the script.
Great. Any last thoughts from you, Emma?
No, like Tim said, I'm excited that this is finally getting a little spotlight on it. It's been a great work in progress, and I'm looking forward to it being utilized in the future, whether that's in Barnstable County or hopefully outside of it via their other data or updated data and things of the sort. So
fantastic. Well, thank you so much to both of you, and keep anyone still on the line, keep your keep your questions coming. Please reach out and have a great afternoon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.